This is the Ag Queen Podcast. This podcast explores the agriculture industry with the movers and shakers of those shaping it. Here's your host, Lori Boyer.
Today, my guest is Christopher Burnett, and Christopher reached out to me on LinkedIn, and I followed up putting together this interview to talk about your idea, Christopher, on creating a nonprofit indoor commercial vertical farm to train military veterans. So tell me first more about yourself and about this concept.
So I've been retired now coming up on about 45 days. My last day on active duty was February 28th. And that's how this came about, was as I was getting ready to transition, I was looking at different options in agriculture, and I found that there's a real gap in terms of our ability to provide training and support to people that are interested in either vertical indoor farming or controlled environment agriculture. So, I mean, I don't want to jump in too early, but that's sort of how all this came to be, and how, more importantly, I'm not a farmer by background. I've always had an interest and a passion for it, but this was more about helping veterans than it was about necessarily extending an agricultural career or interest.
How did you even find out about it? How did you even find this gap that you're talking about?
Well, it's probably an overstatement. I have an interest personally at sort of the hobby level, farmer's market level. And I thought that was something that I was going to do after active duty. But then when I started to look around and I saw how expensive land had become, and then if you can afford the land, how expensive the equipment is, and then if you can afford the land and the equipment, it's almost impossible to compete with the really big commercial farms. So I started to think about younger service members who might be trying to start out, knowing that I believe the average age of a family-owned farm now is in the mid-50s. So we're aging out of an entire generation of producers. And I think you have people that want to get involved and really just don't know how. So as I was going through the process, and it's a 6-month to a year-long process to get ready for retirement, and I was evaluating what I wanted to do, I started to gravitate in this direction for a couple of reasons. My last assignment was at MAR4 Cyber, which is Marine Forces Cyber Command, and we started to work quite a bit with artificial intelligence, mostly in a defensive cyber or offensive cyber capacity. But we were also looking at how artificial intelligence can be used. And I started to look at all of the other applications outside of a military use. And I saw how a lot of the sort of San Francisco tech companies were gravitating to the indoor vertical farming space, treating it more like a startup tech company than traditional agriculture. And what I'm finding out is that you need to have a more grounded approach. You can't just throw money and technology at a problem. You really have to have an understanding of horticulture, have an understanding of, the greenhouse benefits, LED lighting, and then ultimately, how you want to balance that against natural resources. And as I was looking at all of this, I realized this is, one, very complicated. Two, there's not really any training programs available. And then three, I think there are veterans that would benefit from this if we created a pathway into commercial vertical indoor farming that was operating, that they could have access to and then apply. The idea of this program is we'd have a 3, 6, and potentially a 12-month long program where they would get technician level exposure at 3 months, sort of manager trainer level exposure at 6 months. And then in that 12-month program, that would be looking at them as future owner operators of some kind of vertical indoor farming system. And what I'm modeling this after are a number of other programs that exist for traditional farming and ranching. You look under USDA website or in Veterans Affairs, there are a number of programs that are designed as pathways into that traditional approach, but there's really nothing in there for vertical farming or controlled environment agriculture.
I did not realize that. And I was going to ask you about USDA programs that are available for beginning farmers and veterans.
And I think part of it is it's not really viable. So if you start looking at, and I've reached out to a couple of banks and I've asked them, hey, what would you need in order to give somebody a loan? And they've said, well, we would always be interested in a profitable business plan. But the problem they have right now is that there's not a real good track record of viability. So if you wanted to venture into this space, you would either have to have some money or some investment to try to get over the hump of demonstrating that it's viable. So I think we're sort of at an inflection point as you see a lot of the really big commercial indoor farms failing, there's an opportunity, I think, here for some smaller vertical farming, sort of at the very local level, for folks to sort of get their feet wet, learn the industry, and then start contributing meaningfully in a very local way. And that was what we're trying to tap into with this. So my proposal is sitting with the George W. Bush Presidential Center Stand To Veterans Leadership Program. That I should have a determination made sometime in May as to whether or not the proposal will be accepted. And then it's about a 6-month-long program to take the proposal from a concept to an actionable plan. And then it would expose you to investors or donors. And ideally on the back end, I could actually get this thing up and running.
This is pretty cool. This is some new stuff. Like I didn't even know about that program that you're talking about as far as running it through there. But if I'm hearing you right, it sounds like your whole concept is an incubator style program. So you train people into this and then they go out and they do their own startups, right?
Ideally. So, I mean, in the town that I happen to focus on is Hagerstown, Maryland, which is just north of where I live in Gaithersburg, Maryland. It's really the first market that's even viable because this area is so expensive. You just can't find land or commercial space that's affordable. So Hagerstown is a bit of a Rust Belt city just north of where I live. It's struggling quite a bit in terms of there's not a lot of opportunity. It's an aging population, and a lot of the younger folks are unemployed, or there's some drug and other issues up there. So we looked at Hagerstown as a test pilot program, so we could look at an existing structure, convert it into a working commercial farm, and then bring folks in to train them on aeroponics, hydroponics, and aquaponics, and then potentially partner with some of the containerized farming systems so that veterans and their families could get hands-on experience with all those different systems, to include, shipping containers that are converted into microgreen farms. The other part of Hagerstown that's appealing is it can distribute both locally, which is a bit of a food desert, but you also have access to Baltimore and Washington, D.C. So we could look at a regional distribution of an operating commercial farm that's going to give folks access to the tools, techniques, and equipment. And there just happens to be, and this is somewhat of a coincidence, I didn't know this at the time, 3 of the biggest indoor cannabis farmers in Maryland are all in Hagerstown. And they're constantly seeking trained, capable, vertical indoor farming technicians. So we're looking at being able to provide some level of direct path training that if folks want to go work in one of those vertical farms that are making cannabis products, there's a pathway in Hagerstown. If they wanted to go out and work on their own, they would at least have the skills and understanding of the tools and techniques, and they could leverage that. Or I do think there's going to be a rebound. I think you've heard of like Plenty, Bowery, and I think there's another big commercial farm that recently went bankrupt. I think they're going to all come back, and they're going to be needing folks that are trained and understand the technology and the tools to work in a big commercial indoor farm.
Now, you mentioned this training program proposal through a George Bush type program for approval. What is that exactly?
So the George W. Bush Presidential Center, that's his presidential library. It's down in Texas. Every year, they invite people to apply to it's a veterans leadership program. And they're looking for both, veterans or people that support veterans in veterans programs. So in other words, you could have a civilian that works in the Veterans Affairs Department, and they have a proposal to connect veterans to service providers. And then they would use this program to give them the resources or the training to enhance an existing program. But then they will also entertain proposals to create something new. And that was what I submitted. I had submitted a proposal and said, hey, I don't necessarily have a specialty in this area, but I have an interest in agriculture. I have an interest in helping veterans, and I kind of like the technology aspect of this proposal. I think we can get ahead of the power curve and create a training center for veterans that will give them a skill that's going to be in demand right now and certainly in the future.
And will they provide funding then for the program?
They wouldn't provide direct funding, but through a series of weekend, retreats, you'll have access to national level leadership and also corporate leaders that would be potential investors or donors to the program. So as your program would emerge and sort of refine your proposal, you would essentially have a chance to pitch it to people that might either want to partner with you, donate, or in some way contribute.
I see. So that needs to go through 6 months before it's approved. If for some reason it's not approved, then what?
I'm still looking at developing it. It'll be a little bit harder road to go down because with the George W. Bush program backing, that's your foot in the door. I would have a chance to meet corporate executives. I would have a chance to meet national level leadership where I would be pitching them directly under the umbrella and somewhat the credibility of the George W. Bush program. If I were to try to go down this path on my own, I would have to make this pitch without the benefit of any sort of the structure of the George W. Bush program. So I would still be looking to solicit donations, look for partners in academia, partners in the private sector, but I would be just me pitching versus having the benefit of
Right.
the George W. Bush Center behind me.
Gotcha. Yeah. The support, the credibility, all those kinds of things that go along with that. Yeah. Okay.
Now, the other part is I'm trying to set it up as a 501c3, as a nonprofit.
Okay.
And I think that makes it a bit more, and I've spoken to some folks in the industry, and they've said that makes it much easier because I'm not trying to be a competitor. I'm genuinely trying to set up an education program that would basically operate at cost. So if we could have enough production to sustain our costs, that's all we would need to do. We're not looking to compete in the market, to push anybody out. We're not trying to create a for-profit business. We're trying to create something that, one, you could make donations of cash or in-kind services or equipment. And ultimately, the benefit that the private sector gets is they get a pool of trained veterans that at least know how to interact with the equipment, interact with the technology, and know how the cycle operates.
Yeah. Do you have like a cap of the amount of veteran participants per program?
Well, what we're looking at is depending on the size of the facility, that would ultimately dictate how much we could push through there. There was two options that were on the table. Now a third after I spoke to a guy yesterday who he was. So I have a 10,000 foot facility, a 36,000 square foot facility. And now I think a third option that I would be developing would be a custom built greenhouse. It's not vertical so much as just indoor and enhanced.
Okay.
The 10,000 foot facility might be able to get 30 to 40 veterans through in a year. The 36,000 square foot facility, we think we could get anywhere from 80 to 100. And then the custom glass house, I'm guessing would be much smaller. We'd probably be between 15 and 30 a year.
Would the veterans have to apply to be a part of the program?
It would. And that's also what I'd have to figure out is there's a couple of programs that I would want to leverage. Obviously, we'd want to be able to provide the training for free.
Sure.
It would be ideal if we could offset that with some kind of a USDA or VA subsidy. So in other words, every qualified veteran would, we would get some kind of a payment to offset the cost of hosting that individual. I wouldn't want this to be a charged service.
Right.
Then the question becomes if you have seats that are subsidized or otherwise paid for through a program for veterans, could I provide a complimentary service to non-veterans and then charge? And then that way they're getting both veterans and non-veterans are getting a certificate or credentialing that would be helpful in the industry. Haven't really cracked that nut yet.
Yeah.
That's sort of step 8. I'm at step 2.
I don't know. You're pretty far along. This is very well thought out. I mean, you're moving forward on this thing. I have been to a few vertical farms, more of a smaller size, I guess, if you will, more on the educational side, like community colleges or youth programs and things like that. So let's talk just a little bit more in depth on the facility itself. So have you decided like how you're going to lay it out and what all is going to be in there?
We have, and with each facility, it would have a different configuration. And a lot of it would have to do with, one, how much money we have available to either purchase the equipment or to accept donations of either a complete or partial system. The 10,000 square foot facility, for example, I think only has 10-foot ceilings. So you would be limited in the way you could configure that building. It's also not as wide open as you might want. You would have to kind of have it broken up, and it might not be as efficient of a setup. The preferred building is a big expense and with big risk. Is 36,000 square feet, 14-foot ceilings. There we could have areas broken out by approximately 10,000 square feet of hydroponics, 10,000 square feet of aeroponics, and approximately 6,000 square feet of aquaponics. That would allow us to have anywhere from a 2 to 4,000 foot walk-in refrigerator and then a processing area so that the students could sort of participate in an active commercial farm from seeding through cleaning and packaging and distribution. And then there's a loading bay in the back where we would be able to then do regional distribution for sales to, again, help offset the costs. That same facility that's 36,000 square feet also has 2 acres behind the building where we might want to look at putting in either a small greenhouse or some other structure where we would have seasonal outdoor, or I guess, an extended outdoor farming area to give them exposure to all 3 of the indoor vertical farming systems, hydro, aero, and aqua, 1 or 2 containerized farms on site, and then maybe in that 2 acres outside, having either a greenhouse or something where they would also get their hands in the dirt and see more of the traditional side of extending a season rather than just doing all artificial growing inside.
Yeah.
And then the custom build, haven't really cracked that nut yet. That came from a guy I spoke to yesterday. And of course, he was selling his service. He was like, "Hey, we have this other thing. You should consider this." And I said, "Well, that's great. That's more money we'd have to raise, so to speak."
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And keeping up with the technology. These, you talked about AI to start us off. I mean, this stuff is changing rapidly, and the technologies that come out for farming in general, let alone vertical farming, new style of farming, change quickly.
It really does. It's and that was part of my initial interest in this, is I can't help but think this is going to be a big part of future production. I just can't help but think that whenever you look at the technology enhanced capabilities, some of the automation and robotics, it's not really viable right now. I mean, you look at some of the different systems. You're paying for the novelty of a head of lettuce that was produced indoors in an artificial setting, and it's $5 for a head of lettuce versus traditional farming. It's $1.50. That's not really a sustainable market. The novelty of it wears off. But you're starting to see global markets respond favorably, particularly in the Middle East, areas where they don't have fresh produce and they have plenty of energy. They really need to think about conserving water. Some of these areas, these indoor vertical farms have really taken off. So where the U.S. market is hyper competitive, I think there's opportunity for growth overseas, which again, that's not going away. Like, this isn't going to transform itself overnight. And I think as technology gets better and the equipment gets better, I don't see this going away. I only see this becoming a bigger and bigger part of our food production.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And based on other interviews that I do, because this is what I do all day, that to feed the world population, we have to go up instead of out. So definitely. Yeah.
So that's it in a nutshell. I hope I did a lot of talking. I apologize. I'm trying to jam in as much as I can.
No, you should be doing all the talking. I'm just here to ask questions, and you're the expert. I do have just a couple more, though, if I may,
Sure,
if you have just a couple more minutes. I know we're over our time. As far as the actual crops that you intend to grow, at least at the start, I'm picturing lettuce, right? Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Well, I think we would start as simple as possible to have a durable, predictable production. That would be your leafy greens, your microgreens, and maybe getting into a little bit of like peppers and tomatoes. Okay. But as you move along, it gets more complicated. And as you move along that spectrum, it becomes a bit more difficult. What I would want to be able to demonstrate is from seeding to harvesting. And that's where your microgreens and your leafy greens are ideal when you're looking at a 3-month and 6-month rotation of individuals. Whenever you're getting out to that year-long fellowship, then I think they could get into more of some of the speculative indoor farming crops, which are like your tomatoes, your peppers, and some other things that it takes a little bit more time and it's going to take a little bit more effort. And I want to make sure that we have some level of sustainability and viability with things that are predictable, leafy greens and microgreens, before we would push further into things that are coming online, but have proven to be difficult with some of the indoor vertical technology.
Does the plan include any startup funding for the veterans that go through the program so they can turn around and get started?
At this point, it doesn't, but that's part of this conversation, so to speak. The few people that I've spoken to at the VA and the USDA, everybody has a similar response where they're sort of like, yeah, this is a good idea. Mm-hmm. And if you could attach some kind of certification or credentialing, it would be like what a lot of community colleges have for new farmers. You go through a beginning farmers program and they give you a certificate of completion, and that at least opens the door for a bank or a lender to say, okay, this person at least has been through basic level of introduction. They have a business plan, and they might, weigh that against giving somebody a startup loan or some kind of entry level support. But that would be the direction we'd want to take this, is to show that, one, we can train these folks, that two, there's a demand for it, there's a place for them to go. And then ultimately, if we can also extend or expand the USDA support for indoor farming, that would be a bonus.
Yeah, it's thinking along the same lines you were, because there's also the entrepreneurship and management aspect to this as well. And a lot of colleges do have a program. You go through it, and then some of them are competitions that I've interviewed on, and then somebody wins, they get $10,000 or whatever. But yeah.
So I reached out to the University of Maryland Extension Program, and they do quite a bit of agriculture, and they were very interested that if I can pull this off, essentially, they were like, well, of course we'd want to partner with you, but you've got to stand it up, but the minute you would create it and it's running, we would want to partner with you from a research and education standpoint, which is good to know, but that doesn't really help at this phase where I'm trying to get some energy behind actually leasing or buying the building, partnering with private sector to either purchase, lease, or have equipment donated, and then build this into a program that we're going to start bringing in veterans and training.
Thanks for tuning in to this edition of the Ag Queen Podcast with your host, Lori Boyer.